So today we're going to discuss the Sutta of the Kālāmas, perhaps one of the most famous suttas for the modern day. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in helping to foster a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, both in your own life and for those lives around you, consider subscribing to the channel. So the Sutta for the Kālāmas, or the Kalama Sutta, is probably one of the most famous when it comes to a sort of contemporary understanding of the Buddha's teaching. And in the background here, the Buddha went with a bunch of his monastics, his monks, as he always did, or usually did, to a small town called Kesaputta, which was a town inhabited by a tribe of people called the Kālāmas. And these people apparently lived at a crossroads. A lot of wandering ascetics came through there, teaching their own views, and it left the Kālāmas utterly confused. And so they went to the Buddha and they said, we have all these, what they would call, they said, Brahmins and ascetics coming through. Brahmins being the highest caste within ancient India and modern India, who were basically religious teachers, who followed the Vedas, which were ancient books of religious teaching in ancient India. And the ascetics would have been other people, either Brahmins who left that fold, or else people from other castes in ancient India, who would have gone into the forest, let's say, to study by themselves or with small groups, and came up with their own ideas. And so these people would come through this town of Kesaputta, and they would argue, or at least they would say, they would be asked by the inhabitants, okay, give a talk on how you see things, and they would, according to this text, they would spend most of their time denigrating everybody else, talking about how bad that was, and how wrong this guy was, and how you can't believe this. And it ended up that the inhabitants of this town just didn't know what to believe. And so that's the background of the talk that the Buddha eventually gave them. And the beginning of the Buddha's talk is really, really interesting from a Western philosophical context. Basically what he said was, there are a number of different ways that people claim to know things that are really not adequate. This is what we might call, in the broad sense, epistemology. How do we know what we know? How do we claim to know what we know? And the Buddha said, there are a number of different ways of approaching knowledge that you just shouldn't follow. And these, he gave a number of them, but in broad outline, they come into three groups. The first group would be tradition. The second group would be pure reason. And the third group would be personal authority. So for the first one, we'll start a little bit there with tradition. So most of the Brahmins, he was almost certainly talking about the Brahmins here, they claimed to believe what they did, or claimed to know what they did, because of these Vedas that were supposedly revealed to certain rishis or teachers many, many centuries earlier. And the Buddha said, look, we can't rely on that kind of teaching because we don't know where it comes from. We don't know if it's reliable. We just don't know. We're just given these oral teachings without any actually background reason to actually accept them. He also says we shouldn't accept teaching based on a lineage. So just because someone says, I learned it from my teacher who learned it from so-and-so all back 10 generations, that doesn't really have anything to do with the validity of the teaching. And I think it's actually kind of interesting that many contemporary schools of Buddhism do follow lineages very, very closely. So they'll say, the reason that our teaching of Buddhism is correct is because we can trace it back through this lineage, back to the, even back to the historical Buddha, even though that's really not likely. Nevertheless, that's the claim. And of course, he says that you shouldn't accept something based on mere rumor or mere hearsay. Somebody else says, there's some rumor that it's true. Obviously, that's not a good reason to accept something. Now, his second category is pure reason, or pure reasoning. And this is also a category that may surprise some of us. We may say, look, pure reason is a great reason to accept something. But I think if we think about it a little bit, we'll realize what the Buddha is getting at, which is that a lot of what passes for pure reason is really rationalization, or it's some kind of some kind of an argument that is based on sort of logical inference, but is based on axioms that themselves may not be true. And I think if, to the extent that we've been around any kind of online discussion forums or discussion groups, we'll have seen this from time to time. So basically the Buddha is saying, that, you can't accept something based simply on some kind of a reasoned argument. There's more that's needed. And the third category is personal authority. You don't accept something based on what he calls the seeming competence of the speaker. So some speaker can sound very competent, be very, we might say, silver-tongued speaker, very charismatic, but that doesn't mean that what they're saying is true. And we have to be very careful about that and say, look, this sounded really nice, but then let's investigate it. And similarly, we shouldn't accept something simply because the person teaching us is our teacher. And this, of course, happens a lot, even in, let's say, contemporary religion, contemporary Buddhism. People will accept something simply on the word of a teacher because someone is our teacher. And the Buddha says specifically, you shouldn't do that. You should investigate the claims on their own, and not solely because they come out of somebody's mouth to whom you are a student. So now this list of things ends us in what we might call a sort of skeptical quandary, because it sounds like we've demolished almost every form of evidence that we tend to use every day. But instead, the Buddha suggests what we might call, from a contemporary standpoint, a broadly empirical approach. That is, that we don't rely on scripture, we don't rely on authority, we don't rely on simple mere reasoning, but we rely on an empirical kind of approach to the tasks at hand. And in particular, the Buddha turns towards ethics. That is, he's not discussing with the Kālāmas issues about cosmology. I mean, he just doesn't discuss that at all. His main focus was ethics. That is, if you want to know what's wrong, you look at what's blameworthy. You look at what's unwholesome. You look at what is, as he says, censured by the wise, that the wise say this is not the correct thing to do. And you look at what causes harm and suffering in the world. And once you find that, again, this would be by empirical investigation, then you abandon that kind of action. Now, I mean, here we have to say that this teaching of the Buddha is somewhat controversial, or I should say, somewhat problematic, because he says we should look to the wise. And of course, in the previous section, he already said that we shouldn't accept things on authority. And so we may wonder, how are we supposed to determine who the wise people are? Because we're not supposed to say our teachers are wise necessarily. We're not supposed to say that someone who's a good speaker is wise necessarily. We're not supposed to go on tradition or lineage of teachers. So, where are we supposed to find these wise people? And I think this is a question that the Buddha leaves open here. Instead, he moves right to the meat of the point, which is he asks about greed, hatred, and delusion. And he says, well, look, let's take greed. Is greed wholesome or unwholesome? Is hatred wholesome or unwholesome? Are they censured by the wise or not? Do they lead to harm and suffering or not? And even if we leave aside the issue of the wise, we can see pretty clearly, and the Kālāmas, at least in this text, claim to see clearly for themselves, that greed and hatred and delusion were not wholesome, and that all of them led to harm and suffering for people. Obviously, hatred led towards quarrels and disputes and killing and so on, and greed as well. Greed led towards people stealing from one another and even killing and so on. So then from the negative, the Buddha turned to the positive and asked, well, okay, if we agree about that, then what about non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion? Which we might gloss as non-greed would be generosity and renunciation. Non-hatred would be being kind and being compassionate. Non-delusion would be being wise. Is kindness and generosity and wisdom, are those blameworthy? Of course not. Are those unwholesome? No, they're wholesome. Do they lead to our welfare and happiness? Yes, they seem to. Being kind to one another leads to your welfare and happiness. So as a result, given this kind of teaching, the Buddha says he recommends what was called in the day the Brahmavihara practice, what we might call metta practice, that is loving kindness practice, compassion practice, which is an aspect of loving kindness practice, sympathetic joy, which is to strive to be joyful in other people's success, and equanimity practice, to practice being equanimous with the way things are. And these are the practices that therefore he recommended as clearly appropriate, because they would help us reach a higher level of our own welfare and reach a higher level of happiness. Then he turned to what he called the four assurances. So he said, if you approach life in this way, you can be assured of four things. And the first one is that if there is rebirth, you will be reborn well. Now, of course, we know that the Buddha did teach rebirth. He taught that rebirth tended to follow our karmic consequences, so that if we did good things, we would be rewarded for them. And if we did bad things, we would be punished for them. So, in the Buddha's teaching, look, the first assurance is if this is true, then you'll have a good rebirth, if you follow this kind of practice. The second assurance is, I think, of more interest to those of us of a secular mindset, which is that even if there is no rebirth, even if when we die we're not reborn anywhere, nevertheless we still lead a life of happiness and ease. Because, of course, we're not getting ourselves into trouble. We are being kind to one another. We are being compassionate to one another. And that tends to lead towards a happy life. The third assurance, which is similar to the first, is that if evil comes to evil, then I will be okay. Even if there's no rebirth or whatever, leaving rebirth aside, if we generally understand that people who do bad things have bad consequences happen, then, I should be pretty safe. That's the third assurance. And the fourth assurance is, even if some harm comes to me while I practice kindness and compassion, still I am pure in two ways. Now, it's not entirely clear from the text what he means by those two ways, but Bhikkhu Bodhi, who is a great translator of these early texts, in a footnote says that he thinks, and this sounds reasonable to me, that the two ways would be that you are pure in your outward conduct towards one another, and you're also pure in your inward mental conduct. So basically the fourth assurance is that even if some harm does come to you in this life, nevertheless, you're blameless for it. You've behaved well, you've thought well. And there's nothing else you can do. You have no final control over the way the world does eventually react to that. So that is basically the entirety of the Buddha's teaching to the Kālāmas. And at the end of it, the Kālāmas were said to have agreed with him and wanted to follow him. It is, I think, worthwhile to note at the end that Bhikkhu Bodhi himself, the translator I just mentioned, has an essay about this text where he notes that while some people do take it as a very modern kind of document about free inquiry and free understanding of the world, nevertheless, we have to understand it within its context, that the Buddha here was teaching people who didn't know anything about the Dhamma yet, that they hadn't heard his teaching, they weren't his followers. Bhikkhu Bodhi notes that if the teaching had been given to monastics or his own followers, it would have been somewhat different, and he would have had perhaps a higher regard for the general issue of faith in his own abilities and so on. And this perhaps reflects on the points I made earlier about certain forms of contemporary Buddhism accepting more about, let's say, the lineage of teachers and so on. So I think I think that, as a matter of fact, I think Bhikkhu Bodhi is right that this particular text is not entirely representative of the Buddha's teaching, although I think it does fit into that teaching quite well. I think it has to be understood in a broader context. And I think that the Buddha's teaching to the Kālāmas fits exactly into what I've been mentioning on these videos, which is that we want to try to live a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life. Basically, that is very much the message that the Buddha gives to the Kālāmas. We want to live a kinder life. We want to follow the practice of the Brahmaviharas, of loving kindness and compassion. We want to live a wiser life. For the same reasons, we want to make sure that we are interacting with one another in ways that are praiseworthy by the wise, which are just these kinds of ways. And again, living a kinder life is liable to make our lives less stress-filled. There's going to be less competition. There's going to be less argument and dispute and contradiction and strife among us, to the extent that we pursue a kinder kind of approach. So in general, I would say this is definitely one of my favorite suttas in the whole canon. I hope you enjoyed it too. I hope you've enjoyed my outline of it here. If you have any comments and questions about the sutta, I'd really be interested to hear. And please do leave them down below so that other people can interact and learn from the same question. And thanks so much for watching, and we will catch you on the next video. Bye-bye.